The war had carved deep scars across the Pacific, leaving destruction, despair, and fear in its wake. In 1945, as American forces advanced across islands formerly under Japanese control, a group of Japanese nurses found themselves witnessing a reality they could never have imagined. They had been trained to serve the emperor and his soldiers, to prioritize loyalty over compassion. Yet what they saw challenged everything they had been taught. The nurses were stationed near makeshift field hospitals, tending to injured soldiers of the Japanese army. Rumors whispered among them that American medics were merciless, treating only their own and leaving enemy children and civilians to suffer. When a convoy of American soldiers arrived to assist with medical operations, the nurses gathered at the edges, curiosity mixed with trepidation. They wanted to observe, to confirm that the enemy was as heartless as propaganda had insisted. The first sight struck them silent. American medics moved swiftly and efficiently, carrying stretchers not for soldiers alone, but for small children. Children of Japanese civilians caught in the crossfire, who had been orphaned, wounded, or abandoned. The nurses watched as the medics cleaned, bandaged, and fed these children before attending to their own soldiers. Every touch was careful, every word gentle, every action deliberate. A young nurse, Akiko, could hardly believe her eyes. She had been trained to expect cruelty, to see the enemy as merciless monsters. Yet here were men she had been taught to fear, kneeling beside tiny figures, calming their cries and offering comfort. Her hands, previously busy with her own patients, trembled as she took in the scene. Some of her colleagues whispered, questioning whether this was a trap, a ploy, or a temporary display meant to confuse and manipulate. But the sincerity in the Americans' gestures left little room for doubt. One child, no more than 5 years old, had a deep gash along his arm, and his small body shook with fever. An American medic approached, gently cleaning the wound, speaking soothing words the nurses could not understand. Akiko saw the child relax, eyes closing in relief, as the soldier adjusted blankets and offered water. Her mind struggled to reconcile the disparity between the enemy she had feared and the human compassion before her. By the afternoon, the nurses observed a rhythm emerge. American medics moved systematically, ensuring that every child, civilian, and wounded soldier received attention. No child was left to cry unattended. No parent went without reassurance. The nurses were particularly struck by the restraint exercised toward Japanese soldiers. While these men had been trained to fight fiercely, they were treated with firm professionalism rather than vengeance or humiliation. Akiko finally approached, cautiously, offering to assist. One of the American medics looked up, smiled warmly, and gestured for her to help distribute bandages. She hesitated, then stepped forward, feeling a strange blend of fear, awe, and newfound understanding. Her colleagues, hesitant at first, soon joined her, participating under the guidance of the Americans. By evening, the nurses were exhausted but changed. They had witnessed acts of mercy that contradicted every warning they had received. Back in their quarters, Akiko scribbled in her journal, trying to capture the shock and the profound questions it raised. How could these men, who were supposed to be enemies, exhibit such care? Could humanity survive even in the midst of war? Night fell over the makeshift camp, but the memory of the day's events lingered like a stubborn flame. The nurses gathered around a small lantern, whispering in hushed tones about what they had seen. The shock had not yet faded. They had been trained to anticipate cruelty from the Americans, yet every act of kindness, every careful touch, contradicted the lessons of fear embedded in their minds. Akiko could not stop thinking about the children. She remembered one boy, no older than 6, whose leg had been fractured during a skirmish. His cries had pierced her heart, but the American medic's calm, patient hands had soothed him. They had not rushed, they had not scolded, and they certainly had not inflicted punishment. Instead, the soldier had whispered reassurances, adjusted the splint meticulously, and smiled at the boy with gentle encouragement. Akiko had never seen such patience, and it made her question everything she had accepted as truth. The nurses began to follow the American medics more closely the next morning. They saw the men distribute food and water with precision, making sure no one went hungry. Children received warm rice and broth, even when Japanese soldiers still awaited their own meals. Some of the nurses initially felt a pang of jealousy, but that emotion was quickly replaced with wonder. How could a soldier, trained for combat and violence, treat the enemy's children with such care? Akiko's colleague, Haruko, whispered, "They are teaching us something, I think. Not with words, but with actions." Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and awe. Perhaps this is how mercy is taught. As the days passed, the nurses began to participate more actively. They helped clean the wards, prepared blankets, and assisted with feeding. The Americans never forced them. Every gesture of inclusion was gentle, respectful, and deliberate. They maintained distance, allowing the Japanese women to act without intrusion, yet they remained close enough to guide and protect. One afternoon, a small group of Japanese soldiers, injured and exhausted, arrived at the camp. The nurses held their breath, anticipating harsh treatment or humiliation. But the Americans treated them with the same professionalism, ensuring that their wounds were cleaned, dressed, and carefully monitored. The nurses realized that this was not merely an act of charity toward children. It was a fundamental approach to humanity itself. Every life, enemy or ally, deserved care and dignity. Akiko's notebook filled rapidly with observations. She recorded the meticulous attention to detail, the patience, the restraint. She wrote of a young nurse, barely 18, who had approached an injured boy with fear in her eyes. The medic had stepped back, allowing the nurse to offer comfort first, guiding her hands softly. "See," Akiko wrote, "it is not only what they do, but how they do it. They respect boundaries. They trust us to act with care." By the end of the week, the Japanese nurses had begun to experience a transformation. Their training had emphasized obedience, fear, and loyalty, but what they were witnessing taught empathy, restraint, and the complexity of human morality. They started to question not only their previous assumptions about the Americans, but also the broader understanding of war and honor. One evening, a mother approached the nurses, carrying her child who had been ill with a high fever. She whispered thanks to them, a quiet acknowledgement of care that transcended language and culture. The nurses realized that the Americans' actions had not only helped the children, but had empowered them to act with kindness as well. For the first time, they saw themselves as agents of care rather than mere instruments of a militarized system. Akiko reflected on the contrast between what she had expected and what had actually happened. The war had taught her fear, but the Americans had shown her a kind of courage rooted in mercy. In their silence, their careful distance, and their consistent acts of care, they conveyed a lesson far greater than any propaganda could instill, that true strength could coexist with compassion. As the days turned into weeks, the nurses began to see the full scope of the Americans' care. It was not limited to the children alone. The medics ensured that all civilians, injured soldiers, and even elderly villagers received attention, food, and warmth. The nurses observed that every act of kindness was accompanied by deliberate restraint. Nothing was forced, nothing was taken for granted, and no boundaries were crossed. Akiko noticed that this approach created a quiet ripple of trust. The children, initially terrified of any uniformed figure, now approached the Americans with curiosity and tentative smiles. Mothers, too, began to lower their guard, offering scraps of conversation and gestures of thanks. Even some of the younger Japanese soldiers, wary at first, allowed themselves to be tended to without fear of ridicule or punishment. One morning, a severe storm swept across the camp. Torrential rain turned the pathways into mud and threatened to flood the makeshift wards. The nurses watched in awe as the American soldiers worked tirelessly to secure the tents, elevate the sickbeds, and ensure that everyone remained dry and safe. Not a single word of complaint was uttered, and not a single act of frustration marred the calm efficiency with which they worked. Akiko's admiration grew. This was discipline tempered with empathy, a stark contrast to the rigid, fear-driven obedience she had known. During the storm, a nurse named Midori assisted in carrying a child whose leg had been recently bandaged. She slipped in the mud, heart racing, but an American medic immediately extended a hand to steady her. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance, Akiko saw the quiet humanity that underpinned every action. These men were soldiers, yes, but they were also teachers of restraint, patience, and moral courage. By now, the nurses had begun to see themselves differently. They were no longer mere observers, fearful of judgment or punishment. They were participants in a system that valued life and dignity. They administered care with intention, guided but not dominated, and in doing so, they experienced a new kind of empowerment. The American medics also encouraged communication. They provided paper, pencils, and envelopes so that the nurses and villagers could write to family members. For many Japanese women, this simple act was revolutionary. Letters carried the weight of reassurance, hope, and human connection. Akiko wrote fervently, her hand shaking as she documented the transformation unfolding before her eyes. She described the meticulous care the Americans showed, the trust they extended, and the lessons of mercy they had unknowingly imparted. Weeks later, news spread that the war had officially ended. Victory and surrender were now matters of official record, yet the nurses felt a more personal kind of resolution. The Americans continued their disciplined routine of care, never allowing the ending of conflict to diminish their principles. No one was left neglected, and no one's dignity was compromised. Akiko reflected on her journey. She had arrived at the camp filled with fear, trained to see the Americans as merciless enemies. But in those weeks, she had witnessed actions that challenged every assumption. Wounded children healed before soldiers, careful restraint in every interaction, and a relentless commitment to human dignity. She wrote in her journal, "They have not touched us in ways we feared, yet they have changed us forever. Their mercy is stronger than any weapon." On the day of departure, the nurses accompanied some of the children to American transport ships. Tearful farewells were exchanged, letters clutched tightly in small hands. The nurses realized that their own understanding of war, honor, and humanity had been irrevocably altered. They had learned that power could be wielded without cruelty, that authority could coexist with empathy, and that the measure of a soldier was not only in his ability to fight, but in his capacity to respect life. As the American ships sailed, away, Akiko and her colleagues stood on the shore, watching silently. The children waved, some clutching letters they had written to family members far away. The nurses, too, held their letters close, reminders of the profound lessons they had absorbed. They understood now that the enemy they had been taught to fear had demonstrated a strength greater than any army, the strength to act with compassion in the midst of war. Akiko closed her journal, tears streaming down her face. She had seen the impossible, mercy triumphing over hatred, kindness prevailing over fear, and humanity preserved in a world that had been defined by violence. For the Japanese nurses, the memory of those weeks would remain indelible. It was a lesson not recorded in history books, but etched into their hearts. True courage is measured not by what one destroys, but by what one protects. And as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, Akiko knew that the war's most astonishing legacy would not be counted in battles or victories, but in the lives spared, the dignity maintained, and the enduring, quiet power of human compassion.